Before we dive into one of the most decisive battles in ancient history, let me ask you something. What happens when a 25-year-old king leads 47,000 soldiers against the largest army the ancient world had ever assembled on a battlefield, specifically engineered for their destruction? What happens when genius, discipline, and calculated aggression face overwhelming numbers, home field advantage, and every tactical innovation a desperate empire can muster? You're about to find out. And if you think you know this story because you've seen a movie or read a textbook chapter, I promise you don't know it like this. No Hollywood heroics, no simplified good versus evil narrative. Just the tactics, the terrain, the decisions, and the brutal reality of how Alexander the Great destroyed the Persian Empire in a single afternoon. If this is the kind of history you're here for, hit that like button right now and drop a comment telling me what ancient battle I should cover next. That's all I'm asking. Now let's go back to October 1st, 331 BC, to a plain near the village of Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq, where the fate of two continents would be decided before sunset. The Persian Empire in 331 BC was the largest political entity the world had ever seen. It stretched from Egypt to India, from the Caucasus Mountains to the Arabian Sea. 30 million people lived under Persian rule. The empire had existed for over 2 centuries, surviving wars, rebellions, and internal power struggles. Its administrative system was sophisticated, with satrapies governed by appointed officials, a standardized currency, a network of roads that allowed rapid communication across thousands of miles, and a polyglot military drawn from dozens of subject peoples. At its head was Darius III, a man who had become king through a combination of royal blood and political maneuvering after the previous king and his sons were assassinated. Darius was not incompetent, despite what later Greek propaganda would claim. He was an experienced administrator and had commanded military forces before taking the throne. But he had the misfortune of ruling during the reign of Alexander of Macedon, and that would define his legacy as a failure. Alexander had invaded the Persian Empire in 334 BC with an army of approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry. His father, Philip II of Macedon, had spent 2 decades transforming Macedonia from a backward kingdom into a military superpower. Philip had created the Macedonian phalanx, an infantry formation armed with sarissas, pikes 18 feet long that could outreach any spear or sword. He had professionalized the army, creating a standing force rather than relying on seasonal levies. He had integrated cavalry and infantry tactics in ways that Greek city-states had never managed, and he had planned the invasion of Persia but was assassinated before he could launch it. Alexander inherited the army, the plan, and his father's ambition, then exceeded all of it. The first major battle between Alexander and Darius had been at Issus in 333 BC. Darius had brought a massive army, possibly 100,000 men, into a narrow coastal plain where his numbers were negated by terrain. Alexander's cavalry had broken through the Persian left, driven directly toward Darius's position, and the Persian king had fled the battlefield. It was a humiliating defeat, made worse because Darius abandoned his mother, wife, and children, who were captured by Alexander and treated with respect, a propaganda coup that made Darius look like a coward. After Issus, Alexander had not pursued Darius into the interior of Persia. Instead, he turned south, conquering the Phoenician cities that provided Persia's navy, then taking Egypt, where he was crowned pharaoh and founded the city of Alexandria. By 331 BC, Alexander controlled the entire eastern Mediterranean coast. Persia had lost its naval bases, its access to the sea, and its richest western provinces. Darius needed a decisive victory, and he needed it immediately. Darius had spent the 2 years since Issus preparing. He assembled an army larger than anything he had fielded before. Ancient sources claim numbers ranging from 200,000 to over 1 million. Modern historians are skeptical of the highest figures, but a reasonable estimate is that Darius had at least 100,000 men, possibly as many as 150,000. The core was the Persian cavalry, elite units like the Immortals and the Royal Kinsmen cavalry, mounted on the best horses in the empire. There were infantry from across the empire: Medes, Bactrians, Sogdians, Armenians, Cappadocians, Syrians, Mesopotamians, Indians. Some were heavily armored, others were light skirmishers. Darius also deployed specialized units designed specifically to counter Macedonian tactics. Scythed chariots, vehicles with blades attached to the wheels and axles, designed to cut through infantry formations. War elephants from India, 15 of them, terrifying beasts that could trample horses and men. And he chose the battlefield carefully. The plain near Gaugamela, east of the Tigris River, was perfect for Darius's purposes. It was flat, open, with no rivers or forests to break up formations. This was crucial because Darius's main advantage was numbers, and numbers require space to deploy. A narrow battlefield like Issus would negate that advantage. Darius went further. He ordered the ground leveled and cleared of any obstacles that might interfere with his chariots. The battlefield was prepared like a racing track, smooth and wide, giving his cavalry maximum maneuverability. It was a calculated decision. Darius was forcing Alexander to fight on ground where Persian strengths, mobility and numbers could be fully utilized. Alexander's army in 331 BC numbered approximately 47,000 men. 7,000 were cavalry, including the companion cavalry, elite Macedonian horsemen who formed Alexander's shock force, and the Thessalian cavalry, equally skilled and crucial for protecting the flanks. 40,000 were infantry. The core was the phalanx, 6 brigades totaling about 12,000 men, each soldier carrying a sarissa and a small shield, trained to fight in tight formation where the overlapping pikes created a nearly impenetrable wall. The hypaspists, elite infantry who could fight in phalanx or as more flexible line infantry, numbered around 3,000. The rest were allied Greek hoplites, Thracian and Illyrian light infantry, archers and javelin throwers. It was a balanced, professional force, but it was outnumbered at least 2 to 1, possibly 3 to 1. Alexander knew the odds. His soldiers knew the odds. As the Macedonian army marched east from Egypt, through Syria, across the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, the scale of what they were facing became clear. Persian scouts shadowed them. Refugees fleeing the coming battle told stories of Darius's massive host, of exotic troops from the edges of the world, of chariots that would shred the phalanx like cloth. Morale was fragile. These were veterans, men who had fought at the Granicus River, at Issus, who had stormed Tyre after a 7-month siege, but they were also exhausted from years of campaigning and far from home. Alexander held a council with his senior officers. Parmenion, his second-in-command, a general who had served Alexander's father and was old enough to be Alexander's grandfather, advised a night attack. Hit the Persians before dawn when they were disorganized, use the darkness to negate Persian numerical superiority. It was sound tactical advice. Alexander refused. He reportedly said he would not steal victory. Whether he actually believed that or whether it was posturing for morale is debatable. What matters is the decision. Alexander wanted a clear daylight battle where his tactical skill and his soldiers' discipline would be undeniable. He also understood psychology. A night attack might win the battle, but leave doubt, might make it seem like the Macedonians were afraid to face the Persians openly. Alexander needed not just to defeat Darius, but to break him so completely that the Persian Empire would collapse. That required a victory that could not be questioned. On the night of September 30th, 331 BC, the two armies camped within sight of each other on the plain of Gaugamela. Darius kept his entire army in formation through the night, fearing a night attack. The Persians stood to arms, exhausted, nervous, staring into the darkness. The Macedonians slept. Alexander made sure his men rested, ate, checked their equipment. He walked through the camp, visible, confident, reassuring. and he planned. He studied the battlefield as much as the darkness allowed, assessed the Persian deployment from reports and observation, and finalized his tactics. The plan was risky, brilliant, and entirely dependent on timing and discipline. At dawn on October 1st, the armies deployed. Darius placed himself in the center, traditional for a Persian king, surrounded by his best infantry and the royal cavalry. His plan was to use his superior numbers to envelop both Macedonian flanks while the center held. The scythed chariots were positioned in front of the center and left, ready to charge and disrupt the Macedonian phalanx. The elephants were held in reserve. On the Persian left, facing the Macedonian right where Alexander would be, Darius placed strong cavalry forces. Bactrians, Scythians, Massagetae, steppe nomads, who were among the finest horsemen in the world. On the Persian right, facing Parmenion and the Macedonian left, were more cavalry and infantry, tasked with the critical job of enveloping and crushing the Macedonian flank. Alexander deployed in an unusual formation. The phalanx was in the center, but instead of a simple line, he arranged his forces in a diagonal echelon. The right wing, where Alexander commanded with the companion cavalry, was advanced. The left wing, under Parmenion with the Thessalian cavalry, was refused, pulled back. Behind the main line, Alexander placed a second line, a reserve force that could face about and fight if the Persians managed to encircle the army. This was unprecedented. It acknowledged the possibility of encirclement and prepared for it. The formation was also angled, not parallel to the Persian line, designed to draw the Persians out of position. The battle began with the scythed chariots. Darius ordered them forward, 200 chariots thundering across the plain toward the Macedonian line. It should have been devastating. The chariots were designed to break infantry formations, the scythes cutting men and pikes, creating gaps that cavalry could exploit. But Alexander had prepared for this. As the chariots approached, the Macedonian light infantry, javelin throwers and archers concentrated their fire. Horses were hit, drivers killed, chariots crashed or veered off course. Those that made it through faced the phalanx, but instead of a solid wall, the phalanx opened lanes. The sarissas tilted up or to the sides, creating corridors. The chariots, already disrupted, rolled through the gaps and were swarmed by the rear-line troops. The scythed chariot attack failed almost completely. A few chariots broke through and caused casualties, but the tactic that was supposed to shatter the Macedonian center had been neutralized in minutes. With the chariots spent, the cavalry engagement began. On the Macedonian right, Alexander led a probing advance with the companion cavalry and light infantry. He was deliberately pulling the Persian left toward him, stretching the Persian line. The Bactrian and Scythian cavalry engaged, fierce warriors who were not intimidated by Macedonian reputation. The fighting was chaotic, cavalry charges and countercharges, swords and spears, horses colliding. Alexander's goal was not to win this fight immediately, but to create an opening. On the Macedonian left, Parmenion faced intense pressure. The Persian right wing, commanded by Mazius, a capable Persian general, was trying to envelop the Thessalian cavalry and roll up the Macedonian flank. Parmenion's forces were being pushed back, struggling to maintain formation. And then Alexander saw it. As the Persian left moved to engage him, a gap opened in the Persian center. It wasn't large, but it was there, between the Persian cavalry engaged on their left and the infantry guarding Darius in the center. This was the moment. Alexander had been waiting for this, had designed his entire battle plan around creating this gap. He wheeled the companion cavalry, formed them into a wedge formation, and charged directly at the gap. The companion cavalry wedge was a Macedonian innovation, a dense formation with Alexander at the tip, designed to punch through enemy lines like a spearpoint. The cavalry hit the gap at full speed, smashing into the Persian infantry who were trying to close the opening. The Macedonians drove deeper, cutting through resistance, aiming directly for Darius's position. The hypaspists and part of the phalanx followed, widening the breach, preventing the Persians from sealing it. This was combined arms at its finest. Cavalry created the breach, infantry exploited and secured it. Darius, positioned in his chariot with a clear view of the battlefield, saw Alexander's cavalry driving toward him. The distance closed rapidly. The royal guard cavalry tried to intercept, but they were engaged or swept aside. Darius faced a decision: stay and rally his forces or flee. He had faced this choice before at Issus, and he had fled. He made the same choice again. Darius turned his chariot and rode east, away from the battlefield, abandoning his army for the second time in 2 years. The effect on Persian morale was catastrophic. The soldiers fighting on the left and center saw their king fleeing. Some units broke immediately, following Darius in retreat. Others fought on, but cohesion was gone. The Macedonian phalanx in the center pushed forward, engaging the Persian infantry, who were now leaderless and disorganized. The Persian cavalry on the right, under Audacious, was still pressing hard against Parmenion. In fact, Parmenion was in serious trouble. Some Persian cavalry had broken through and were attacking the Macedonian baggage train in the rear. Parmenion sent messengers to Alexander asking for reinforcements. Alexander faced his own critical decision. He was in the middle of pursuing Darius, the chance to capture the Persian king and end the war definitively within his grasp. But his left flank was collapsing, and if Parmenion's wing broke, the Persians could encircle the entire Macedonian army from behind. Abandoning the pursuit, Alexander turned the companion cavalry and rode back to support Parmenion. On the way, he encountered Persian cavalry who had broken through the center and were heading to the rear. A sharp, brutal cavalry engagement erupted, Macedonians against Persians in close quarters, swords and maces, no room for lances. Alexander's men won, but it was costly. Some of Alexander's closest companions were killed. Alexander himself was nearly surrounded before his guards cut a path out. By the time Alexander reached Parmenion, the crisis had passed. The Thessalian cavalry had held, and the Persian cavalry, seeing the center collapsing and Darius fled, were beginning to withdraw. Audacious, recognizing the battle was lost, ordered a retreat. The Persian army disintegrated. Units that were still intact fled east or south. Those that were trapped or too slow were cut down. The Macedonian cavalry pursued for miles, cutting down fleeing soldiers, but Darius had too much of a head start. He escaped again. The casualties at Gaugamela are difficult to estimate with precision. Ancient sources are unreliable, often exaggerating enemy losses and minimizing their own. The most credible accounts suggest that the Macedonians lost around 500 men killed, with several thousand wounded. Persian losses were catastrophic. Estimates range from 40,000 to 90,000 killed, with tens of thousands more captured. The Macedonian phalanx and cavalry had inflicted a slaughter. The battlefield was covered with Persian dead, abandoned equipment, and the wreckage of chariots. The elephants, which had barely been used in the battle, were captured. It was total victory, but the real significance of Gaugamela was not the casualties. It was the collapse of Persian political and military power. Darius fled east into Media, trying to rally forces for another stand, but his authority was shattered. Satraps began surrendering or defecting. Cities opened their gates to Alexander rather than face siege. Within a month of Gaugamela, Alexander entered Babylon without resistance. The city's gates were opened, and the population welcomed him as a liberator from Persian rule, whether genuine or pragmatic. Babylon was one of the richest cities in the world, and its treasuries were handed over intact. Alexander crowned himself king of Babylon, adopting Persian titles and customs, a signal that he intended not to destroy the empire, but to rule it. From Babylon, Alexander marched to Susa, another of the great Persian capitals, which also surrendered without a fight. The treasuries of Susa contained 50,000 talents of gold and silver, an almost incomprehensible fortune. Then Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, the city where Persian kings were crowned. Persepolis resisted briefly, but fell in early 330 BC. Alexander allowed his troops to sack the city, a decision that remains controversial. The official explanation was revenge for the Persian invasion of Greece a century and a half earlier when Xerxes had burned Athens, but it was also pragmatic. Persepolis was a symbol of Persian imperial power. Destroying it sent a message that the old order was finished. The royal palace was burned, either deliberately or in a drunken accident, accounts vary. The wealth seized from Persepolis was estimated at 120,000 talents. Alexander now controlled more wealth than the Macedonian and Greek world combined had possessed before the invasion. Darius continued fleeing east into the remote eastern provinces of the empire, still hoping to rally an army. He made it to Bactria, a region in what is now Afghanistan and Uzbekistan, where the satrap Bessus commanded forces. But Bessus and other Persian nobles saw Darius as a liability. A king who had fled 2 battles, who had lost the empire's heartland, was useless. In the summer of 330 BC, Bessus and his co-conspirators murdered Darius, stabbing him and leaving him to die on the side of a road. When Alexander's forces found Darius's body, Alexander reportedly wept, whether from genuine emotion or political theater. He gave Darius a royal burial, another propaganda move, positioning himself as the legitimate successor to the Persian throne, not a foreign conqueror, but the rightful king, avenging a murdered predecessor. With Darius dead, Alexander declared himself King of Asia, a title that encompassed the entirety of the Persian Empire and implicitly claimed dominion over all lands to the east. There was no one left with a credible claim to challenge him. Bessus tried, declaring himself the new Persian king, but he lacked support and was eventually betrayed, captured, and executed by Alexander. The remaining years of Alexander's campaigns, from 330 to 323 BC, were spent consolidating control over the eastern provinces, fighting in the mountains of Central Asia, crossing into India, and pushing as far as the Indus River before his exhausted army refused to go further. Gaugamela was the hinge. Everything that came before, the crossing into Asia, the battles at Granicus and Issus, the sieges of Tyre and Gaza, the conquest of Egypt, were preparation. Everything that came after, the march to India, the founding of cities, the spread of Hellenistic culture across Asia, the fusion of Greek and Eastern traditions, was consequence. On that plain near Gaugamela, in a battle that lasted perhaps 4 hours, the course of history turned. How did 47,000 Macedonians defeat an army twice or 3 times their size on ground chosen by the enemy? Start with leadership. Alexander was 25 years old at Gaugamela, but he was a tactical genius. He understood that numerical superiority means nothing if you can't bring all your forces to bear simultaneously. His angled deployment, the use of light infantry to disrupt the chariots, the deliberate pulling of the Persian left to create a gap, the wedge charge at the decisive moment, all of it was planned and executed with precision. Darius, by contrast, was reactive. He prepared the battlefield, but had no coherent plan once the battle began. His decision to flee when Alexander's cavalry broke through sealed the defeat. A king who abandons his army twice is not a king anyone will follow. Then discipline. The Macedonian phalanx and cavalry were professional soldiers, trained to follow orders under extreme stress. When the scythed chariots charged, the phalanx didn't break and run, they opened lanes on command. When Alexander saw the gap and charged, the hypaspists followed immediately, without hesitation. When Parmenian's wing was under pressure, the Thessalian cavalry held, buying time for Alexander to return. That level of coordination requires years of training and a command structure that functions under chaos. The Persian army was larger, but it was a coalition of different peoples with different languages, different fighting styles, and no unified tactical doctrine. Once the center broke and Darius fled, there was no mechanism to rally them. Tactics matter. The Macedonian sarissa, 18 feet long, outreached Persian spears and swords. A Persian infantryman with a 6-foot spear could not get close to a phalanx soldier with an 18-foot pike. The Persian answer had been the scythed chariots, and Alexander neutralized them. The companion cavalry wedge, a dense, fast shock formation, could break through infantry lines that traditional cavalry charges couldn't penetrate. The integration of cavalry and infantry, with each supporting the other, created tactical flexibility that the Persians couldn't match. Geography and logistics. Alexander's army had marched over 1,000 miles from Macedonia, across rivers, deserts, mountains, and had been campaigning for 3 years. They were deep in enemy territory, outnumbered, with supply lines that stretched back to the Mediterranean. By all logic, they should have been vulnerable, desperate, prone to collapse under pressure, but Alexander had secured his logistics. He controlled the coast, which meant supplies could be shipped from Greece, Egypt, and Phoenicia. He had a fleet that kept the sea lanes open. He had allied cities that provided food and reinforcements. Darius had the advantage of fighting in his own territory, but his logistics were chaotic. Feeding an army of 100,000 in a pre-industrial society is a nightmare. The Persian supply system, designed for an empire at peace, couldn't sustain a mobile army for extended campaigns. Many of Darius's troops were regional levies, not professional soldiers, and they had been standing in formation all night before the battle even started. Finally, psychological factors. The Macedonians believed they were going to win. Alexander had never lost a battle. His soldiers had seen him lead from the front, share their hardships, reward their bravery. He projected absolute confidence, and it was contagious. The Persians had already lost twice. Darius had fled twice. The morale advantage was entirely with the Macedonians, and in a battle where cohesion and willingness to stand under pressure are decisive, morale wins wars. The long-term consequences of Gaugamela reshaped the ancient world. The Persian Empire, which had dominated the Near East for over 2 centuries, ceased to exist as a unified political entity. The Hellenistic Age began, a period where Greek culture, language, philosophy, and art spread across Asia. Alexander founded dozens of cities, many named Alexandria, populated with Greek and Macedonian veterans, that became centers of Hellenistic culture. Greek became the lingua franca of the Eastern Mediterranean and Near East, a status it would hold for centuries. The fusion of Greek and Eastern cultures produced new art forms, new philosophies, new scientific inquiry. The Library of Alexandria, the Septuagint translation of the Hebrew Bible into Greek, the spread of Stoic and Epicurean philosophy, all were products of the Hellenistic world that Gaugamela made possible. Alexander himself would die 8 years after Gaugamela, in 323 BC in Babylon, either from disease, poison, or the cumulative damage of years of wounds and excessive drinking. He was 32 years old. He had no clear heir. His empire fragmented immediately into warring kingdoms ruled by his generals, the Diadochi, the successors. The Ptolemies took Egypt. The Seleucids took Syria and Mesopotamia. The Antigonids took Macedonia. These Hellenistic kingdoms would dominate the region until Rome conquered them, one by one, over the next 3 centuries. And here's the final irony. Alexander conquered the Persian Empire in the name of Greek revenge for Xerxes' invasion, framing himself as the champion of Hellenism against Asian despotism. But he spent the last years of his life adopting Persian customs, marrying Persian noblewomen, insisting his Macedonian officers bow in the Persian style, integrating Persian soldiers into his army. He was more interested in ruling the Persian Empire than dismantling it. His Macedonian veterans resented this. They had come to conquer Persia, not to become Persians. The cultural conflict between Alexander's vision of a fusion empire and his soldiers' desire for Greek supremacy was never resolved, because he died before it could be. But on October 1st, 331 BC, none of that mattered. On that plain near Gaugamela, Alexander charged through a gap in the Persian lines. Darius fled, and the greatest empire the world had known to that point shattered like glass. 47,000 disciplined, professional soldiers, led by a genius who understood how to turn numerical disadvantage into tactical opportunity, destroyed an army twice their size. One battle, one afternoon, one wedge charge, and the map of the ancient world was redrawn. That's the story of Gaugamela. No myths, no Alexander's god propaganda, just the tactics, the decisions, and the brutal mathematics of ancient warfare. If this is the kind of history you want more of, subscribe to this channel right now. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a video. Share this with anyone who thinks ancient history is boring or that battles are just about who has more soldiers. Drop a comment telling me what you thought, what I missed, what ancient battle you want me to cover next. This is history without the filter, the kind that shows you how the world actually changed, and we're just getting started.